I agree with Peter, it's unconstitutional, and ultimately, I do not see any way, shape, or form that changes are not going to have to be made.
Yes, Senator, I'm glad you brought up Medicaid, so the next question.
Sure.
There's some proposals, I think Bill Randall's one of the guys running for governor, supports Medicaid being block granted to the states. Is that something that you would support?
I think that a block granting program works, but it only works when you also get the authority to determine how you manage the program. And what I mean by that is if they're going to give you the money, but they give you all the strings that still come with it, you're never going to be able to meet their mandates. If you give us the money and give us the flexibility to implement the program and operate the program the way that we see fit, we at least have a fighting chance. But what it really comes down to is what additional mandates come with that block grant. But I can tell you this, no matter what we do, it's got to be better than the process we're working in right now. The number of people on Medicaid, the growth of Medicaid, and what it's financially doing to our state is absolutely horrendous. And if we do not get it under control, our state budget is going to continue to struggle like it has for the last 5 years.
Senator, certainly right. In their infinite wisdom, our federal masters in the Congress and in the executive branch wrote a law using Bernie Madoff accounting. Poor old Bernie Madoff is doing 155 years in prison for the kind of accounting fraud that is embedded in this bill. And in order to make the federal deficit smaller, supposedly, let's use air quotes for that, they offloaded costs in the manner that indicated by Senator Lager on the states. This is a plan, this is a conscious strategic plan to force states to increase taxes. A few of them have let the cat out of that bag and said that that is their goal. How many of you have seen your tuition and your costs go up in higher education over the last 3-4 years? You're seeing them go up again. It's just a question of how much for the coming academic year. Medicaid expansion is already crowding out, before the enactment of this bill, is crowding out funding for K through 12 education, for higher education, for mental health, for corrections, for highways, for everything state government does. What this is an abandonment of sovereignty of Missourians as a self-governing entity in this country and just handing it off to federal masters. And that is why it has to be opposed. And yes, I do support Medicaid block grants to the state. It would be a big improvement.
All right. One of the proposals, this was a question I asked somebody in the audience, was in the state senate right now, or earlier this year, there was a proposal to move teacher tenure, to change teacher tenure from 5 years to 10 years to extend how long a teacher has to serve. We'll start with Peter Kinder. Is that something you support, that you think tenure needs to be changed?
I absolutely do. I'm a supporter of reform, and more reform in K through 12 education. And, you know, I filed the constitutional challenge on my own as a private citizen and as lieutenant governor of the state. I watched the governor be a spectator on Obamacare. I watched the attorney general be on the sidelines spectating on Obamacare. I said, somebody in state government's got to get in this fight for all the foregoing stated reasons. So I filed the constitutional challenge. And I privately financed it. There's not a nickel of your taxpayer money in it. I raised the money to finance that challenge. And your question was what?
Because that's teacher tenure.
Teacher tenure. Analogous. Teacher tenure must be reformed. When I went out and hired my lawyer for that, he doesn't have tenure with me. I had foot surgery this winter. I had a bone spur taken off my foot. My surgeon did not have tenure. The tenure does not apply in any other aspect of professional life. And I do not think that a last in, you know, the current system is a good one, where the first in are the last to be laid off, even if they're lousy. I favor incentive pay. I favor paying good teachers more, and a system that identifies the excellence in the classroom and pays them more. Now, I don't want to be unfair to teachers, but the idea that you get tenure after a year or 2 or 3 of teaching for a lifetime, for 45 years, a applies in no other sector, and we should have reform of tenure.
So,
Thank you. This is an interesting topic because what it really starts to come down to is the overarching debate of education and what is the future of education in our state and our nation. I actually share the feelings of Peter in that ultimately, if someone's not getting the job done, they need to be removed. And that's whether it's in the private sector, that's whether it's in the public sector. You know, I come from a public education background. My mom's a public school teacher. And so we've had some interesting discussions about this, and about all the reforms around public education. But on Easter Sunday, we're sitting there having lunch, and I asked her, I said, listen, there's a proposal coming, and you know, if you were me, just out of curiosity, what would you do? Would you vote for it, or would you vote against it? And in this particular proposal that you're talking about changing it from the tenure years being, you actually would have the opportunity to be granted tenure after 5 years. What this would do is change it to 10 years. There's only one state in the nation that does not have tenure. If we make this change, Missouri would be the longest timeline to get to tenure. And you know, I thought her answer was pretty insightful. She said, you know, I've worked in public education for almost 30 years, and I've seen good teachers and I've seen bad teachers. And she said, overwhelmingly, the majority of the time, bad teachers never get to the point where they have tenure anyway. She said, I really don't think that tenure does that much. And it's an interesting discussion, and it's a great debate, whatever. But at the end of the day, let's be honest with ourselves. You know, I have a 4-year-old and a 9-month-old. The type of jobs that Andy and Addison are going to have, we have no idea. What I really want as a parent is I want my children to learn how to teach themselves, so that as they evolve through life, regardless of what happens, you can always continue to educate yourself. And you know, that's a fundamentally different way of thinking about it than the way that we thought about it 20 years ago. So just like all of you right now, you're involved in the public policy process. I mean, if you care enough to come here on a Saturday afternoon that's as beautiful as it is outside, you care about the future of your state, you care about the future of your country. And you know what? No matter what great public policies we set, if we do not have an educated workforce, we are not going to have the economic opportunities that we could have. And so with that said, I believe that this is going to be the first step in many reforms of our public education system.
okay. We've got about 10 minutes left. I want to give you guys each a little bit to close. Just for your close, I want Senator Logger to ask you, you're challenging a sitting lieutenant governor. He's been there for 4 years. What is different about you? Why do you need that seat?
You know, Peter and I were friends before this race, we're going to be friends during this race, and we're going to be friends after this race. When I entered the lieutenant governor's race, at that time, Peter was still running for governor. And I entered this race for one reason, because I believe that we have to fundamentally change the way that our state operates if we're going to fundamentally change the economic opportunities of our state. When you stop and look at where we are, in the last 100 years, only 2 states in our nation have not had double-digit economic growth in at least 1 decade. Missouri is one of the 2. In 1900, Missouri had 16 congressional delegates. Today we have 8, which means the rest of the country has grown proportionally that much faster than we have. And the one that's most concerning is if you take the real growth of GDP over the last 10 years and you rank all 50 states, Missouri's 48th out of 50. Well, I don't know about you guys, but as a father, as a husband, as an entrepreneur, I find all of those unacceptable. And the reality is that I entered the race for lieutenant governor because I believe we can do better. I actually believe that the private sector will always do a better job of meeting the needs of society than a big government program. I actually believe that consumers should pick winners and losers, not government programs, not politicians. I actually believe that the most important thing that we do every year is balance our state's budget, and the priorities of our state are reflected there. And I don't know about you, but for me, this is an election cycle about the future. This is about what do we want our state to look like. And I would submit to you, I would ask you to ask yourself a simple question. Do I want a state that looks more like California, Illinois, and Michigan? Or do I want a state that looks like Texas and Indiana and Florida? You know, that's pretty easy for me. So I'm in this race because I believe we need elected officials who still understand what it's like to be in the private sector. I mean, that's part of the beauty of what our founding fathers put together. It's part of the beauty of the legislature. The day that we allow career politicians like Jay Nixon to go for decades without ever having a job or earning a real dollar or actually producing a dollar, I mean, 30 years of never being a productive member but always taking a government check, it fundamentally changes who they are. And I'm in this race because I believe that we have to start talking about the future and where are we going to go and what's that climate going to look like. Because for me, the government doesn't create jobs, the private sector creates jobs, and we create the public policy through litigation, regulation, taxation, and ultimately we have to make sure that we have a strong education base. So this is an election about the future, and I'm in this race because I believe that I have a vision and I have a direction that I think our state should go, and I'm going to spend the next several months traveling our state and sharing that direction and that vision.
Why do you deserve a second under Trump?
Well, every election is about the future. I've never been through an election cycle in which some candidate stood before a group of voters and said, this election's about what happened 5 years ago. But what happened in previous years and what the candidate's record shows from those previous years does give you certain guideposts for the future about which every election turns on. So let's review the record. If you go back over the conservative reform agenda and the battle to enact it over the last 15 years, you will find me at the center of every battle. I was elected in 1992 and took office as John Ashcroft was leading governor. The governorship and Mel Carnahan, a very depressing winter day, was sworn in. The Democrats controlled everything in Jefferson City except one of the 6 constitutional statewide offices. They had a huge majority in the House, and I was the 13th Republican in the Senate out of 34. I looked around that Senate chamber where they were shoving a tax increase through in 1993 over my no vote and my opposition, and I said, we've got to go to work to change this. I spent the decade of the 90s trying to get the Republican majority, trying to get a conservative reform majority. It was 1 step forward and 2 steps back. It was enormously frustrating. But when the table was finally set in the 2001, that winter, we went up with a majority in 2001 in January, and I became the first Republican Senate President pro tem in 53 years. But even before, I was in the majority. 15 years ago this year, I passed the first. Do you care about the pro-life issue? I'm the only candidate in this race who has the Missouri Right to Life Defender of Life Award on my wall, awarded to me because of my efforts through the 90s in battling for the unborn and passing that year Missouri's first ban on partial birth abortion, putting it on the governor's desk and leading the veto override effort. That was when I was still a backbencher, very much scorned in the minority. Then we come into the majority. Do you care about Second Amendment rights of law-abiding gun owners? In 2003, we culminated under my leadership as Senate President pro tem with the new Republican majority, and we overrode the governor's veto to enact the right to carry concealed weapons in our state. Missouri became the 37th state to extend this natural extension of the right of self-defense under our Second Amendment to all citizens. Up to that day, my fellow Republicans, in 180 years of statehood, there had been 6 successful veto overrides. In 180 years of statehood. Catherine Hanaway as House Speaker and I as President Pro Tem of the Senate led 3 veto overrides in one day of